Good morning. Welcome to the session on the book launch for Islamic Empires, 15 Cities That Define a Civilization by Justin Marozzi. And we'll be following that up with a wider discussion on the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. My name is Hasan Karrar. I'll be moderating this session. I'm imagining this as a three-part session. Initially, we'll have Justin talk about the book, some of the ideas that inspired the book and the research and the scholarship that's gone into it. Beyond that, we'll branch out into a wider discussion of history and three Islamic empires in particular. And finally, we'll open it up to audience questions and you'll have a chance to engage with the speakers. By way of very quick introduction, I just want to introduce the guests that we have with us today. Audrey Truschke is a historian of Mughal India at Rutgers University. She's the author of Cultures of Encounter, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, and another book on Aurangzeb, The Life and Legacy of India's Most Controversial King. Kaya Genc is a novelist and essayist. He is the author of The Lion and the Nightingale, A Journey Through Modern Turkey, Under the Shadow, Rage and Revolution in Modern Turkey, and an Istanbul anthology, Travel Writings Through the Centuries. And finally, Justin Marozzi is the author of South from Barbary, Along the Slave Routes of the Libyan Sahara, Tamerlane, Sword of Islam, Conqueror of the World, The Man Who Invented History, Travels with Herodotus, and Baghdad, City of Peace, City of Blood. So welcome once again. Justin, I want to begin with you. Congratulations on the book. It's thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and as I was halfway through the book, I was reminded of Calvino and Invisible Cities. And it struck me at that point that perhaps I was making that connection where that connection didn't actually need to be made. It's been about 15 years since I read Calvino. But I noticed at the very end, you yourself also bring up Calvino. So I just want to begin by asking you how you thought about approaching the history of the Muslim world through cities and the particular schema that you've used in which you describe 15 cities over 15 centuries.
Thank you very much, Hasan, and it's absolutely a delight and a pleasure and a privilege to be back in Lahore after many years. I think that the answer to that question really is that I spent several years before this book, about 4 to 5 years, researching a history of Baghdad, which sort of killed me from the time and effort and intellectual challenge to do that. And I thought, if that was difficult, let's do 15 cities to cover the 15 centuries of Islam, starting in the 7th century in Mecca, and tracing the story of Islam exclusively through different urban centers at different periods. So it's quite a personal selection. I regret to say, and I apologize to our audience today, that Lahore isn't in the list. It probably really should be. But it is a personal selection of cities that I also know to a greater or lesser extent. And the fact that Lahore isn't in the book maybe leaves an opportunity to come back to Lahore at a later date. But they tell their different stories of Islam in particular periods, or times of greater or lesser cosmopolitanism, interfaith coexistence, military and economic self-confidence and pluralism, and so on.
Okay. And you used the term empire in the title of the book, and I was wondering if we could unpack that term a little bit. I imagine empires as being multi-ethnic states, but beyond conquest, what might be some other ways in which we can think about empires?
Well, I mean, and also, when does the first Islamic empire begin? At what point does the Arab conquests merge into an empire? And when does unified command begin? I mean, you could say relatively early on, the Islamic empire starts to fragment. I mean, fairly early on in the time of the Abbasids in Baghdad, the empire is fracturing, and there are splinters in the Umayyads in Cordoba, the Fatimids, and so on and so forth. But I think there is maybe more of a cultural continuity, and the word the Islamic empires. There's a perhaps a greater continuity in terms of Islamic civilization, and so I think that's where the politics and the Arabs being bedeviled by fitna, internal strife and conflict, is a bit of a theme as well. But I think this geographical surge of conquest so early on, to such an extent, posed enormous challenges of keeping this single entity together as a coherent whole. And then that duly happens. Ibn Khaldun, different theorists of empire talk about the ebb and flow, how a dynasty rises up, becomes all powerful, then becomes decadent and corrupt and is overtaken by another dynasty, and so on and so forth. And we see that happening throughout, really.
Sure, sure. Just by way of sort of describing some of what you've done in this book, you have some slides and images. Would we be able to run through some of those at this point?
Okay, let's do that. And I should preface this by saying normally this takes 50 minutes, so we're going to try to do it in 5 to 10. These are just the summary overview of the 15 cities.
Yeah.
There was no contest about where this story should begin. In Mecca, the birth of Islam, 610 and the Prophet Muhammad's revelations. I also found Mecca interesting in a way, the lodestar of Islam at a very obvious level, but equally, perhaps the least interesting culturally in terms of spreading its culture beyond Islam. It's closed to the outside world. Non-Muslims are prohibited. Of these 15 cities, 2 I've yet to visit. One is Mecca, which will remain elusive, and the other is Isfahan, which I mean to visit. Terrible historical destruction in this new development. The Royal Mecca Hilton is on the site of Mecca's oldest historical sites, including the house of the Prophet's wife, now a public lavatory. The early chapters really focus on the empire specifically and the then headquarters of the caliphate. So from Mecca we go to Damascus in the 8th century, the 7th, 8th century with the Umayyads, architectural splendor. Also throughout the book I've tried to bring in the present occasionally for travel writing and reportage, Damascus today. What was a paradise on earth for many Arab writers of the medieval period has become, in the UN's words, a hell on earth. In the last 9 years, this terrible tragedy unfolding in Syria. Baghdad, again, I think no contest for my 9th century. Can everyone see the slides, by the way? Do I need to move? Okay. More discoveries were made in mathematics and medicine in the 9th century in Baghdad than in any previous period in history. So it becomes literally the capital of the world, which is all the more remarkable when you consider that the city was actually founded only in 762. It's not as ancient as many of the other cities on the Mesopotamian plain. It's also the seat of this great sectarian divide, which manifests itself very early between Sunni and Shia. And architecturally in Baghdad, you see that across the river Tigris. The Abu Hanifa shrine, sacred for the Sunni population, and across the river, the Qadimain shrine for the Shia, but both spectacular architectural marvels. We then zoom across way, way, way west to the westernmost part of the Islamic world in Al-Andalus, Cordoba, where the then cathedral is turned into a mosque. Well, I got that right one. Mesquita Cathedral. Today, Muslims are not allowed to pray in it. It's the scene of occasional scuffles and disputes. Medinat al-Zahra, the resplendent city, the shining city, which consumed a third of all Umayyad state revenues in the 40 years that it took to build. Just a sort of a fabulous palace. Jerusalem snuck in my 11th century, 1099, literally. I often choose big events or big characters. Babur comes later. This was the First Crusade as a bit of a set piece on relations between Christian West and Muslim East, the most contested city on earth, which it remains to this day. The oldest Islamic monument. Godfrey of Bouillon reveling in the slaughter. The Crusader accounts are incredibly vivid, boasting about horses and riders riding up to their bridles in blood, killing down innocent Muslims in the city. Cairo, in a way I see this as Saladin's revenge and the ultimate triumph and the eclipse of the Crusader kingdoms in the Middle East, and his great monument, which is, I think, my favorite place in Cairo, the Citadel, which just remains one of the great sites in the city. Also, time of remarkable tolerance. Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher, takes refuge in Cairo. The Geniza documents are this wonderful treasure trove of documents discovered in the 19th century. Many of them online now at Cambridge University. But this theme of tolerance is a repeated thing. The cities at their greatest, and you'd contrast that obviously with somewhere like Damascus today or Baghdad, 40% Jewish in 1917, no Jews left at all in the city, hollowed out and sort of culturally more arid. Fez, I keep saying a lot of these are my favorite cities. Fez is definitely one of my favorite cities. The most wonderful Medina. navigating to a dinner party with my wife a couple of years ago. I said, don't worry, we'll find our way on Google Maps. Press the phone, long pause, unable to find a route. I thought that was fantastic, this medieval labyrinthine Medina outfoxing the Californian IT prophets. Tamerlane I'd written about before, as Hasan mentioned. He was from my 14th century. And Samarkand, a city which became one of the greatest metropolises in the world, almost exclusively through pillaging others. And again, I have to say, in the name of jihad. Tamerlane defined himself as a Muslim. Many people might disown him, but he sees himself a Turkic Mongol conqueror. But as in contemporary jihad, one might argue that the overwhelming victims of his jihad were Muslim rather than Jews or Christians. And here he is ordering his soldiers after the fall of Damascus, each one had to bring him 2 heads. They're piled up into these terrible towers covered in oil, set alight as a sort of early 14th century masterclass in strategic communications. You mess with me, you resist, this is what fate awaits you. And many cities chose to fold because, why wouldn't you? The Registan in Samarkand actually postdates Tamerlane. That's his tomb today. Sword of Islam, conqueror of the world. And the architectural legacy of these lovely iridescent blue turquoise ribbed domes throughout Central Asia. Istanbul, Constantinople. Really, again, the final end of Christian Constantinople. It was described as a bone in the throat of Allah, this last Christian enclave. 22-year-old Sultan Mehmet, who grows up as a child, determined to conquer the city, which had eluded Muslim armies for 800 years. He's the first to make it happen with the most brilliantly conceived, meticulously planned military expedition by sea and land. It's just great drama. And that also fits into one of Justin's favorite cities category very easily. My wife and I joked, if Jeremy Corbyn had been elected Prime Minister a couple of months ago, we'd go and live in Istanbul. But I think Lahore would have some competition from Lahore now. Babur. Now again, which is more important, Lahore or Kabul? Obviously, I would say Lahore, but I had to bring Babur into the city. I love his Babur-Namah, one of the greatest memoirs of the Middle Ages. High-spirited, an amazingly present author, talking about hashish parties, drinking wine, his military conflict, the snow falling in the mountains. It's incredibly vivid diary he kept for decades, and a fantastic gardener. One of his nicknames was the Gardener King. And the Aga Khan Foundation has restored the Babur's Gardens, which is one of the most beautiful monuments in a war-torn Kabul. When I first saw it in '96, it was terribly destroyed, shot up by the Mujahideen in the ruinous fighting that followed the Soviet withdrawal in 1989. Today, it's looking in much better shape, but the city, as we all know, remains a theater of war. 18 years after 9/11, that's been my normal commuting way in and out of the city with the British government as an advisor to the Afghan government on 40-year-old, slightly creaky British helicopters, which do not inspire much confidence. Safavids, Shah Abbas, really master planner of a new city, which becomes the greatest city, or one of the greatest cities in the world, the 17th century. Like, Haussmann's Paris, Pierre L'Enfant's Washington, he creates the city, almost from scratch. Tripoli, I use for my 18th century, not hugely culturally important, but it's a city I know and have been traveling to since I was 18, and there's a very interesting, it's the first time the Americans go to war as an independent nation is against the Tripoli Corsairs, and here's the bombardment of Tripoli in 1804, and again, I wrote this at the time of the Libyan Revolution and reported there as a journalist. Here's one of the Tripoli's youngest revolutionaries. Like so many of aftermaths of Western interventions, it's been disastrous since 2011 in Libya, and the fighting rages on as we speak. Tripoli, old city, lovely, terribly neglected, architecturally crumbling. Beirut, my father was born in 1938. I thought that was my great 19th century. I was talking to a Lahori lady last night. She said, you could have had Lahore as your 19th century, and I'm sure she's absolutely right. But Beirut, the sort of family background, and it goes from a very sleepy provincial little port to a booming metropolis. But 1975 to 1990, torn apart again, civil war, sectarian divisions, which still rumble on, even rage on to this day. Dubai goes from little pearl fishing village to slightly sleepy and then booming, free-for-all, laissez-faire city in the 20th century. Sheikh Zayed, and that great philosophy, build it and they will come. the Maktoums built it and the world did come. And then I ended in Doha, a very different city from Dubai, similar sort of historical background, almost, and the ability to buy culture, the Museum of Islamic Art, perhaps less welcoming to the world. I'm going to end on what is locally known as the condom, this resplendent figure in Doha's skyline. And that was a sort of, as quickly as I could rush through the 15 cities.
Sure. And can I also say that I really enjoyed the maps in your book. I thought the maps of the city were absolutely terrific, and the one of Dubai was simply startling, especially the timeline that shows how small it was and then the way it's expanded in the recent past. But sort of broadening the discussion a little bit, beyond conquest and expansion, and this question I'd like to pose to you, Audrey, what are different ways in which empires can project their power and authority? And I ask this to you because you write about the role of Sanskrit in the Mughal court, and sort of hoping you can speak to that.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you, Justin, for those lovely slides. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the Mughal Empire, and obviously we think about conquest, right? If you don't have land-based conquest, then you don't have anything upon which to build. But for me, what's interesting about the Mughals comes after the conquest, right? It's after the blood and the guts. It's what do you do with that land and with the wealth that comes with it. And what the Mughals did is they really built this sort of cross-cultural set of exchanges. And in my own work, I have focused a lot on their exchanges with the Sanskrit tradition, and that's by virtue of my training. The Mughals translated well over a dozen Sanskrit texts into Persian, starting in Akbar's period, but going through Jahangir and Shah Jahan's period as well. Another set of exchanges that they did that's sort of harder to see today is that they hosted Sanskrit intellectuals at their court. Right, so we think of the Mughal court as this sort of Persian medium space. And it was that, but there were also people working in Sanskrit there for about 100 years, right? Close to 100 years. And we have some of the text that they wrote in Sanskrit. One thing that is harder to capture is sort of exactly what they were doing all the time at court, however. Who were they talking to? What sorts of conversations were they having? And we can sort of construct bits and pieces of that, right, from what we find in the Sanskrit tradition and what we find in the Persian tradition. But there's always some uncertainty there as well. If I could just add that one thing I was thinking as Justin was sort of showing these slides, and this comes up especially for the Mughals, is what we have left over sort of from the Mughals today in terms of sort of physical things. We have a lot of texts and manuscripts, but then the most visible thing that we have are these stone monuments, right? We have the big fort in Lahore, we have the old city, we have mosques, this sort of thing. And cities were important to the Mughals, right? Cities were so important to Emperor Akbar, the third Mughal king, that he built his own city, Fatehpur Sikri. But another thing that was important to the Mughals were their temporary cities, right? Their sort of encampments. And this is a tradition that comes from Babur, and it goes back even further of sort of living out of tents. And for the Mughals, they used red tents to sort of mark the residence of the king. And all of the major Mughal emperors spent quite a bit of time on the road, right? And, not just a week here or there. It took a long time when you're traveling with tens of thousands of people. So they would be on the road for months, sometimes years at the time. And the center of Mughal power basically moved with the king through these sort of red tented cities, right? There was this sort of mobility of power and sovereignty, and even this mobility of the city in a way that is harder to capture today. We have illustrations of these red tents and something of what it might have looked like. We have written descriptions of them. But due to the temporary nature, we obviously don't have those tent cities. And it's something that I think it's hard to recapture today because we have these sort of grounded monuments that we tend to talk about because it's what we can see. But that was not necessarily the sort of only important way of manifesting power physically for the Mughal emperors.
And broadly speaking, I suppose the tent was really important insofar as the Central Asian tradition is concerned as well.
Absolutely, and I think that's absolutely where they got it, and then they sort of adapted it to their Indic context.
Right.
And one thing that it really helped the Mughal emperors do in particular was to center power in the king, right? So that the center of the empire went wherever the body of the king was, right? So, we say, the capitals of the Mughal empire were, Delhi and Agra and Lahore and Fatehpur Sikri, but really it was wherever Akbar was, or Jahangir was, or Aurangzeb was.
Just a very quick follow-up question. The Sanskrit archive, that's largely extant, right? Those documents sort of are there, I mean, the archive is there in its entirety or not?
That is a very difficult question to answer. It's hard to know exactly what we've lost. We have no document that sort of lists these are all the Sanskrit texts written for Emperor Akbar, so we sort of don't know what we're missing. I can't assume lacuna in the tradition, but I also can't assume that it is fully extant either. We also don't know what's hidden in manuscript archives. There are literally millions of Sanskrit manuscripts, especially in India. You have fewer in Pakistan, although you have a very nice collection here at the Punjab University Library that very few people ever look at. And so, sort of what exactly is in all of these millions of manuscripts does remain somewhat of a mystery. Some of these are not even cataloged, some of them are in private collections, and many exist. I mean, they exist physically in a dusty library somewhere in India, but otherwise they're only known to us through titles and manuscript catalogs. Right now.
Thank you. Kaya, you're working on a history of Turkish literature, and language can be deeply political as well. And I'm hoping you can give us a sense of different ways in which the language evolved over the centuries. I understand this is a fairly broad question, but if you could give us some sense of what the tensions have been as far as language use is concerned, the relationship between Turkish and other languages, the relationship between the classical rendition of the language and the vernaculars.
Of course. I noticed that the TV series Ertuğrul is very popular in Pakistan, so people have interest in the foundations of the Ottoman Empire. And the story begins in the 13th century with a tribe headed by Ertuğrul's sons, Osman, and then his son, Orhan. And even from the beginning, there's a question about the Ottoman foundations, about the conquests that accompanied the foundation of the empire. Was it Islamic in spirit? Were they there to wage jihad against the infidels? Or were they there to make plunder, to enslave people, to just get their goods and stuff? So the Ottoman Empire's foundations is very contested. And in the modern, during the modern Turkish state, the beginning point has moved to the 8th century, to Mongolia, to the Orkhon Valley, where there are some monuments written in the runic script that tells of the troubles that Turkish people had with the Chinese. So, with modern Turkish historiography, the beginning point moves from the 13th century to the 8th century. But the first mention of the Turks in the documents is in the 2nd century BC in Chinese sources. So after that, I mean, if you go as back as 2nd century BC or 8th century, you'll see how language has evolved so tremendously from the runic script to the Uyghur language, to the Arabic script, and then to modern Turkish written in the Latin alphabet. So in 2008, I was doing my military service in a town called Sögüt in northwestern Anatolia. And this is where you find the tomb of Ertuğrul, and this is the foundation place of the Ottoman Empire. So maybe that's where I got the curiosity to write about the history of Ottoman literature. And it's a challenging job, and it's the challenge is to get a complete view of Ottoman literature and what goes in and what goes out. It's a very complicated story. So you have to know many languages, you have to be able to read in many different scripts, and you have to be interested in both epics written in the Middle Ages to modern novels. But it is an education. So if you follow the Turkish story from the Orkhon Valley to Istanbul, to the western parts of Turkey, you'll find a story of expansion, a combination of the holy ideal of waging jihad, but as well as plunder and booty. So at its strongest state in 16th century, the Ottomans ruled over 2 million square miles of area. So compared to the British Empire, it's not very big. But the system was very different. So the system was built on the eyalet system, which allowed for local languages to be preserved. So nowadays the Turkish liberals look up to the Ottoman system as a better system than the centralized republic. So Ottoman history became a contested area, and if you are a Turkish writer, you have lots of reading to do.
Just a sort of quick follow-up. When does this connection with the Orkhon or to the Orkhon inscriptions actually begin? Because the inscriptions themselves are really interesting, and they're also very, very specific. I mean, what the Turkic Kaghan is saying is, don't become like the Chinese, because if you do, then you will lose that edge that you have by virtue of being a steppe warrior. It's got a very, very particular message. So I'm just wondering, sort of, how does that, or when does that connection actually happen? It seems like quite a distance, both in time and in space, to travel.
So these monuments became popular in late 19th century when Turkish nationalism was invented, and there was a reinvention of traditions. And the message in those monuments of you don't hang out with the Chinese. Paradoxically, those monuments were written by Chinese artists. So they made the Chinese write those texts that warn against the Chinese, that warn against mingling with the Chinese. But for Turkish nationalists, especially during 1930s, there was a Turkish side of Nazi ideology. There were some Nazi clubs in Istanbul. And for those people, the manuscripts were very precious because it was saying the same thing. Turk has no friend but the Turk. And those Central Asian lands actually belong to us. So we should go and plunder those places. What Hitler is doing, we should imitate in Central Asia. So there was this great sympathy for Adolf Hitler among these founders of Turkish racism. And so when you want to do some scholarly research in those monuments, you always come across these eccentric figures who were misrepresenting it in some cases and actually and absolutely politicizing those texts. So and also it becomes a responsibility for you because these are sacred texts for them. It's like their Quran. So if you write about these monuments from a critical distance, they might not like it too much. So it's also challenging to do.
Sure. Just sort of in your book, you describe Muslim societies historically as multi-ethnic, multi-religious communities. Would we say that cosmopolitanism is an interesting way or a useful lens to use historically? Is that?
I mean, in a way, it's quite a fairly modern word that we use today. But I think on reflection, because I started out this project not knowing exactly where it would lead or what sort of common themes might emerge, other than a fairly straightforward narrative chronology. But that cropped up again and again, and then I started seeing it as almost like the sort of the secret ingredient of a successful city, which you can see in whether it's 20th century, 21st century Dubai is a different version of the same thing. A successful city pulls in the world, and an unsuccessful city expels its people. And likewise for a country, look at Assyria has become a nation which exports its people, which is a tragic thing. Baghdad under the Abbasids for the best part of 500 years was a city that drew in the world. And when you draw in the world, you become a cosmopolitan city, which then in turn fuels greater creative discoveries, a real intellectual ferment in these cities when they are multi-faith, multi-ethnic. I mean, I think that the figure I was always struck with that is that Baghdad Jewish figure. 1917, 40% of Baghdad was Jewish. It's unimaginable. I arrived in 2004 to live and work there. At that point, there were 7 Jews left in Baghdad, one of the most ancient Jewish populations on the planet, dating back to the Babylonian captivity, had been hounded into extinction. What does that mean for the cities? It means they sort of wither and die. And in some cases, they give themselves over to sectarian conflict. Baghdad is consumed by intra-Muslim fighting. It's not a cosmopolitan city anymore. So there is that sort of ebb and flow, the movement of populations, economies are affected, intellectual life is affected, civilization, and the show moves on elsewhere in terms of sort of looking for progress, dynamic cities, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that it is an enduring theme.
Sure. Audrey, the Mughal Empire is also a multi-ethnic state, it's a multi-religious state. Is there a sense in which the trope of modernity could be a useful one for thinking about the Mughal state? Is this sort of
Trope of
modernity? Would we say that the Mughal Empire, the Mughal state, if you may, sort of is a modern state? Is there a modernity here? Is there is the fact that this is a sort of a celebrated multi-ethnic state, or a state in which multi-ethnicity is celebrated, at least over the course of the 16th century? Is that something that we can attribute to new ideas of thinking about different people might constitute a state, or is that an older idea that's...
So I suppose I would start by saying that India has been sort of multi-ethnic, or, I mean, that strikes me as a very modern phrase. It's been very cosmopolitan and diverse for an incredibly long time. And it's a sort of, it's been a standard Indian practice, as long as we have had Indian states, to basically patronize everybody. Right? So when we teach this, we always contrast it to European powers, right? Where there was, this sort of idea for many European powers in pre-modernity that whatever the king's religion was, that's what you patronized, and that's what the religion of the people was supposed to be. And the Indian model is something entirely else, right? The king has his religion, the people living under him can have various religious traditions, and the king is going to patronize all of them, right? This sort of, proliferation of patronage across cultural and religious lines. In that sense, when the Mughals come in, what they do is basically adopt this Indian practice that had been going on for well over 1,000 years by this point in time. So in a sense, it's not new. Even for prior Muslim-led empires in India, or polities, if you don't want to use the term empire. I mean, it's not like the Delhi Sultanate states never extended patronage to Hindus or Jains. They did. That said, there is a pretty robust scholarly debate about is there anything modern in the Mughal Empire, and this phrase early modernity comes up. And I am sympathetic to those arguments insofar as part of the goal is to identify something about Indian and, by extension, Pakistani modernity that does not start entirely in the colonial era. Right, that does not make modernity entirely something imposed from colonial powers coming from the West. That said, at least for me, some of the debates about early modernity have they've sort of gone into a space of value judgment that I am uncomfortable with. I am pretty strong on the line that there is a lot to know about the past, far more than how you feel about it and whether it was good or bad in our modern minds. And I think that it's very hard to talk about concepts of modernity without bringing in some of those value judgments that, for me, obscure more than they clarify about history.
Well, I guess what I was thinking about was that in the case of East Asia, for example, in Tokugawa, we talk about a modernity prior to the Europeans. Likewise, in Qing China, one talks about a modernity. And we see it in proto-industrialization. We see it in the multi-ethnic composition of the states being celebrated. And I was just wondering if there's parallels that might be drawn with...
Right, no, it's a very interesting idea, Hasan, and I mean, as I'm sure you know, I mean, there's a sort of just really growing field of comparative sort of India-Chinese studies that I think is very difficult because of the language issues, right? It's sort of hard enough to get a handle on enough Indian languages to do serious historical work, much less adding in Chinese stuff. But I do think that, sort of comparing these two models and sort of thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of each is a promising avenue of future research.
Yeah, absolutely. Kaya, you write, sort of in one of the articles that you sent me, you write about how in the 19th century the sort of identities are shifting as well. There's the emergence of what can be described as a new nationalism, if you may. How does that come about? I mean, how does that how does that sort of emerge out of a longer history of Ottoman growth and development?
In mid-19th century, the era of Tanzimat begins in Istanbul among the intellectual circles. There is a demand for creating a bureaucratic system that stands alongside the Sultan and his Sultanate. So the role of the Prime Minister, the Turkish Prime Minister, is created, and there appears a new class of bureaucrats who are mostly educated in France, sent there by the Ottoman Sultans, and who were first called the Jeune Turks, the young Turks of the Sultan. And the ideas that they bring back concern things from city management to political ideology, and the bureaucracy builds up so much power from the mid-19th century to 1880s that the Ottoman Sultans begin to be fearful of this new power of the modernized class that they have themselves created. And so when you look at figures like this, Sultan Abdülhamid, what he does to the Ottoman parliament, he just closes it with just one signature. What he does is he wants to go back to the old ways the Ottoman state was run. And in early Republican novels and late Ottoman novels, you see that there is much criticism of these bureaucratic classes because these people are seen as immoral fops, who are degenerate, effeminate, and who are undermining the manly nature of the Ottoman state. So there's a strong critique of these classes that then take the shape of racism. So even today, when you look at figures who want a return to the manly and muscular days of the Ottoman state, you see a very alarming language used against the degenerate, the effeminate people who are too westernized and who live in their own worlds. So when you look at the rise of racism in late 19th century, people like Max Nordau, for example, and the book The Degeneration, he doesn't mention any Turkish figures in that book. I think he talks about Oscar Wilde and some famous degenerates that show signs of decay that should be corrected by the racist movement. That book wasn't, I think, translated into Turkish, but the ideas there were very much implemented. And that kind of racist attitude towards the modernizers still resonate in today's Turkey.
Just sort of by way of bringing the Safavids into the discussion as well, I mean, Justin, would you say that there's broad similarities that we might see between how we see the sort of Mughal state developing, evolving, how we see the Ottoman state developing, evolving as well, and sort of and what's happening in the Safavid Empire?
Well, going back to the way I dealt with the Safavids, so it is a discrete chapter, really focusing a little bit more on the leading personality at the time, so Shah Abbas, and the creation of his new capital, which of Isfahan, which is fairly quickly nicknamed Nesfi Jahan, half the world. So I didn't look too far beyond or throughout the entire reign of the Safavids, but I think some of their great rivalry with the Ottomans. There's a divide and rule policy for the Western visitors who come in increasing numbers, and I think looking back on that little discrete chapter of historical research, it struck me that until that point, the Islamic world versus the West had largely been in the ascendancy. And around this time, it's not precise, and this is only one particular city at this time, but under the Safavids, Shah Abbas and Isfahan, there's a sort of rebalancing of the relationship, and the European travelers and diplomats and scientists are coming to sort of sell him their wares, and the technological balance seems to start swinging in the West's favor. So it struck me that there's this a gentle note of decline comes into the picture, even at a time when this great city, the new capital of the Safavid Empire, is flourishing and booming and attracting the world. There's this sort of nagging feeling, especially because we know what follows in the 18th, 19th centuries and into the modern day with the current crisis in the Middle East and the difficulties in a number of Arab Muslim countries, that someone has just sort of pressed a little button now, and from the birth of Islam until early Safavid time, Christianity, Christendom, Western Europe is not in the game. It's not in the mix. And then now there's an acceleration of the relations and a deterioration, perhaps, in the heart of one of the Muslim empires.
Right. Audrey, the sort of Persianate literary culture is a very prominent one in the Mughal court. Is that sort of changing, evolving over the course of the Mughal state? Sort of how does that sort of exist in parallel with the Sanskrit tradition that you study?
Right. So Persian is very much the sort of dominant language for the Mughals. It's the one in which the sort of greatest number of texts are produced. It's the one in which the greatest number of poets are working. It is also the official language of Mughal administration from 1582 onward. This was a sort of initiative of Akbar, but under him, Todar Mal, who comes up with this idea. And administratively, this is actually a very good move. It streamlines all sort of Mughal control. Up until that point, as far as we can tell, many of the Delhi sultanates had conducted business in both Persian and Hindi, so you have to duplicate all your documents and have them translated. So from 1582 onward, in order to enter Mughal service, no matter who you were, no matter what background, what religion you were, you had to learn Persian. And this led to a huge upsurge in the number of people, particularly Hindus, who learned Persian, to the point that, sometimes, certainly by the 18th century, possibly by slightly earlier, more Hindus could read Persian than could read Sanskrit. Right? So we think of Persian as going with sort of, Muslims and Muslim society, and Sanskrit is going with Hindus and Hindu society, but that's not actually very, very accurate for pre-modernity. Persian and Sanskrit sort of coexist at the Mughal court, but Sanskrit falls away at some point, which is in sort of the mid-17th century. And in part, that's a story about the decline of Sanskrit overall, right? Sanskrit is effectively a dead language today outside of sort of Indian government efforts and religious context and a couple of very small Sanskrit-speaking villages. Otherwise, people do not speak Sanskrit today, and that's because the language sort of goes away in the 17th to 18th century. There is also a sort of political impetus for the end of Sanskrit at the Mughal court in particular, which is that when Aurangzeb Alamgir ascends the throne, he wants to distinguish himself from Dara Shikoh, his main competition for the throne. Dara had been into Sanskrit, and so ending the lingering Mughal ties with Sanskrit intellectuals was a good way to sort of say, I'm a different kind of king, I'm Aurangzeb, I'm here to stay. Sort of other note, since we're comparing the Safavids and the Mughals, there is a pretty consistent stream of people coming from the Safavid Empire to the Mughal Empire, particularly Persian medium intellectuals, scholars, poets, authors of various sorts, and they come because the Mughals are richer than the Safavids, and they also come because the Mughals are a bit more tolerant than the Safavids for most of this time period. Right? If you had sort of wonky views on Islam that may not have been okay from the Safavid perspective, the Mughals were generally like, sure, come, it's like not a big issue here. So that sort of served the Mughal Empire very well in terms of creating this kind of cosmopolitan environment.
And Kaya, Persian is also important in the Ottoman court. I mean, that's also sort of got a very central function over there. If you could speak about that a little bit and how that's changing with time as well.
Yes, it was very similar, so used in court documents, but Arabic was used in poetry a lot, and so the Turkish language became a mixture of these two languages. And until the alphabet revolution in 1928, Turks had a great lexicon. The Turkish dictionaries were huge, with a combination of these languages. And so after that, there was a great attempt to erase these words, especially the Persian words, from the modern Turkish language, and find replacements for them. And that made the reading of old manuscripts very difficult, because if you don't learn Persian yourself, your Turkish will not be enough. And for poets, especially modern poets, they write very critically about this, because they lost these words in just like a sultan's signature. The modernizers did the same thing. And so they went to the Orkhon Valley, they went to Central Asia to find replacements, and they started coming with words that they claimed were used in place of these Persian words, these Arabic words, in the 8th century. And you could go to the Çankaya Palace in Ankara, and you could convince the modernizers that the words for bear, for example, was this, and let's use it instead of the Persian words that Turks have used for so long. If you could convince the modernizers, then that word was used. So people started coming with these incredible theories about these replacements.
A new language is being invented.
Yes, and then that problem was fixed when the modernizers decided that the Turks were the first nation on earth. Right. And so that encompasses all history of the world. So they said, you know, we can leave these Persian words in the language because, you know, we're okay with that, we're cool with that.
Thanks for that. We have about 15 minutes, and at this point I'd like to open it up to audience questions. What we'll do is that we'll collect a few. My one request would be that you keep your questions short. That's more democratic. It gives others a chance to ask a question as well. And if you have a comment, perhaps hold that off until the end of the session. So short questions, and please do direct them to one of the speakers.
On the first day of the Lahore Festival, I thought Orhan Pamuk said many fascinating and scintillating things, but what I also particularly remember is how he closed down non-question questions. Anyone who was there that morning, it was a masterclass in dismissing pontification.
Okay. Yeah.
Justin, my question is directly to you. You missed out Lahore in your 15 chosen cities, so we understand and we forgive you for that.
Thank you.
Why did you miss out Delhi? Is it that you had some tacit understanding with William Dalrymple? Anything east of Kabul, India and Delhi, I leave it to you and I'll take up the rest. Thank you.
No, thank you. It is a good question. Are we going to wait for...
Sure, let's just take one or two more questions, and then there's one there, and then, yeah.
This is directed at Audrey. I'm just wondering where most of the evidence of the Persian-Sanskrit exchange is today. Which libraries, which cities, where are these manuscripts found today? Because obviously they're not widely known about and celebrated.
So Islam and Christianity being the two major religions of the world, and the kings of Muslim and Christian leaders were hundreds of years ago conquering and adding to their power, what was the difference between the two? How did they operate? What were their goals? And as different ideologically different people, what happened later when they... Audrey, since you mentioned that, you know, once they got the land, they didn't know what to do with it, or they just constructed, or did they try to convert the people to that religion, or what did they do with that? It was it just for power?
Yes, and my question for Justin, would it be, I mean, I was just fascinated by what you were telling us, and I was wondering that would it be fair to say that by and large the Muslim or the Islamic empires were perhaps a little more tolerant than what we consider as the more Christian empires, like, you know, whatever the Christian empires were? Thank you.
Yeah. Perhaps we can sort of have you answer these and then take another round after this.
Okay, the gentleman who very rightly pointed out why no Delhi and Lahore. There's also a prosaic reason for this, combination of both of personal experience and to be completely ruthlessly honest, budget. To travel to 15 cities and spend enough time in them to make sense of them historically is always going to be a challenge. So Delhi is not a city I know. The idea of coming over for a week or even a month or a little bit longer and making sense of it and then writing something meaningful and useful, I thought I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just choose something that tells a similar story maybe of a city I do know, but it still needs to justify its position in the chronology. And the truth is that, you know, one could choose an entirely different 15 cities here. Although some, I think, you know, Mecca, Damascus, Baghdad need to be there, but plenty of other cities could find their way. I toyed with the idea, for example, of having Bradford in northern England as my 21st century Muslim city, just to give a very different experience of a strongly Islamic community in the West. There's no Jakarta, capital of the largest Muslim country on earth, and so on and so forth. So I have to say, it's a personal list, but I do feel a haunting sense of guilt for not having Lahore and Delhi in the chronology.
So, on the sort of the question of where are these texts today, right? Of sort of evidence of the Sanskrit and Persian exchanges. So they're sort of all over the place. I think the first thing to know is that Sanskrit and Persian manuscripts are most often sort of housed in different archives. Right, a lot of archives will have both, but they tend to have a specialty, right? So when you're doing manuscript research and you work in both Sanskrit and Persian, you have to go to double the number of libraries and archives, which means for a lot of time on the road, it's expensive, there's negotiation with every individual archive, all this sort of thing. I have found manuscripts, you know, sort of all over the place, right? You find them in state archives, you find them in university archives, and you find them in religious archives. I've found a number of useful manuscripts in Jain Bhandars, which are sort of Jain-run libraries attached to Jain temples, usually. Sometimes you find manuscripts in very, very odd places. I would add that a sort of additional difficulty of sort of doing this research is that even if you know that a manuscript is somewhere, you don't always know exactly what that manuscript is, okay? And I'll give you an example from Lahore. So I mentioned at the Punjab University Library here, you actually have a very good collection of pre-modern Sanskrit manuscripts. They were collected by a man by the name of Woolner, who was a well-known Sanskritist from the 19th century. And in the collection is one manuscript titled Parasi Prakasha. Okay, the light on Persian. This is in Sanskrit, and it is a grammar of the Persian language. So if you know Sanskrit, but you don't know Persian, in theory you can learn Persian through this text. It's a fascinating text. The text was printed in the 1960s. Despite that, many years ago, I came to Lahore and saw this manuscript, and I found something pretty interesting. While it bears the same title, it's not exactly the same text, okay? Somebody came along later and edited the text, and this is a sort of abbreviated version. Okay? Which is interesting, right? That tells us all sorts of stuff, that people were still reading this at a certain point in time, that they were still trying to improve on how to teach Persian in Sanskrit. And I wouldn't have known any of that if I hadn't bothered to sort of look up the original manuscript, right? So all of this to say that you find manuscripts in interesting places, and even once texts are printed, you still do need to go back to manuscripts to do real research. On the question of Islam and Christianity, so I would contest that characterization, right? If you want to do a world religions model, you cannot forget Buddhism. It's one of the great sort of, you know, evangelical traditions of pre-modernity. But in any case, you know, you think about somebody like the Mughals. When they come to India, do they try to convert people? And the essential answer is they didn't mind conversion. Conversion was fine, but that was not their primary motive in coming here, and it didn't sort of reflect who they were. Right, so to understand this, I think you have to start with modernity and our assumption today, and it's a very widespread assumption, both within the Muslim world and far beyond the Muslim world, that Muslims are always Muslims first, right? You have to be a Muslim before you can be anything else, an advocate for human rights, just a normal person in the world, a citizen, whatever else you might be, you must be a Muslim first. And that is a very harmful assumption in modernity, and it is completely inaccurate for pre-modernity, right? I think it's more accurate to think about the Mughals as rulers who happened to be Muslim rather than as Muslim kings, right? They were about power, they were about conquest, they were about literature, they were about cross-cultural exchange, they were about all sorts of stuff before they were about Islam, right? There was never a wide sort of state-led effort to convert anyone to Islam under the Mughal Empire. If there had been, honestly, India would be a lot more Muslim today.
We can take sort of
Tolerance.
Could,
Hasan, would you like me to answer that? Or
Sure,
or-
yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that question. The issue of tolerance, I think, is hugely important in the history of the Islamic world among the various empires and at different periods. Broad brush, yes, highly tolerant. Multi-faith, multi-ethnic communities, Istanbul under the Ottomans from 1453 onwards, with Mehmet seeing himself as an emperor in the footsteps, a successor to the Roman Empire, i.e. not necessarily an Islamic empire, a territorial empire in which I command Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others. Highly tolerant. I also think this goes back to the early days of Islam, in which, when Kaya was talking about the start of the Ottomans, was it about raiding? Was it about conversion to Islam? The Arab conquest themselves, which is something I'm studying for a latest project, there are strong financial disincentives to convert non-Muslims to Islam in the early years, during the conquest as well, because once you convert, you no longer pay the jizya poll tax. So that's no good for headquarters in Damascus if everyone is converting to Islam. So there's a bit of a laissez-faire thing. Let the Christians get on with their religion, let the Jews get on with their religion, and over time more and more numbers convert and more start speaking Arabic, and the empire becomes sort of more culturally coherent. I'm going to say a few negative things about tolerance as well. There are periods in which much of the Islamic world is disinterested in the non-Muslim world. I think of the Safavid period in Isfahan, when European visitors flock to the city and they're fascinated by the culture there, the Muslim culture, costumes, court etiquette, protocol, diet, hygiene, you name it. And there's a sort of monumental disinterest in these European visitors on behalf of the Safavid rulers. And occasionally you do see that, and one might say uncharitably, it is possibly a part of Islam's superiority complex as the last revealed Abrahamic religion. We know what the Jews are like, we know what the Christians are like, but we are the superior civilization with the superior culture. And then the final note on tolerance is, I think, the role Saudi Arabia has played in recent decades is one of profound intolerance towards other faith. There are textbooks in Saudi Arabia which say deeply spiteful and hateful things about Jews and Muslims, and young people are growing up, or have been growing up for decades, thinking that Christians and Jews are lower life forms. And Mecca, as the sort of spiritual hinterland, is a very different place under the Wahhabi Saudi form of Islam. I came a remarkable quote. When the Wahhabis first came into the scene in the late 18th century, they were described as heretics with beards. And so the transformation of a splinter sect of Islam to the dominant proselytized version of Islam funded by petrodollars, I think has had a deleterious impact on cultural tolerance between the faiths.
very quickly, please. Yeah.
Problem of what would be the medium of instruction, English or the local languages. In Turkey, you just spoke about how much of your vocabulary you lost with the alphabet revolution, as you called it. Is there any possibility of going back to the original script, and whether and the possibility of recovering the vocabulary you have lost? Thank you.
Well, there was an attempt to have Ottoman script courses in high schools, I think 5 years ago. But that's the problem with the Turkish government. When they do something like that, when they introduce these kind of classes, the reaction from the left is, no, this will bring us back to the dark times, we should just stick with our modern language. And if you're a historian, who's a secular historian, but who wants to read those manuscripts, and when you support them, you're called a traitor, because how can you side with them? So there are some attempts that would make reading of these manuscripts possible, but because of the opposition to the government, and mostly the cultural sector has opposed this, and it's very troubling, because if you're a poet, if you're a novelist, you want to read a novel written in 1915 or 1910. When Henry James was writing his books, you cannot read his Turkish equivalents. And so some attempts has been made, and in Bosphorus University, one of the most prestigious universities of Turkey, there are some private courses where people learn both Sufi techniques, Sufi music, Sufi culture, and also the Ottoman script. And the feminist movement was very instrumental in this, because they discovered that Ottomans had a very strong feminist current in late 19th century. And when they found that kind of historical link, they wanted to go back to those sources. Let's go back to the Ottoman feminists. Let's try to understand what they were writing. So among the feminists, there was this great increased interest in the Ottoman script, which I hope the Turkish left will also follow.
Audrey, Kaya, Justin, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you.